Have you ever had that sinking feeling that you're being judged, criticized, or even actively disliked? That strange sensation when you walk into a room and conversations seem to shift? That moment when you share an idea and watch as eyes dart away uncomfortably? What if I told you this feeling might not be paranoia at all, but rather a sign you're doing something right? What if the very resistance you encounter is actually evidence you're on a path to something extraordinary? The sensation of being disliked, criticized, or misunderstood isn't just common. It might be inevitable if you're doing anything meaningful with your life. And throughout history, the most influential figures discovered something counterintuitive. They didn't succeed despite opposition, but because of how they transformed that opposition into fuel for their journey. The universal experience of rejection. Aristotle once observed, "To avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing." Think about that for a moment. The only way to completely avoid disapproval is to essentially disappear, to become invisible to the world. Throughout history, virtually every person who created meaningful change faced significant opposition. Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth with his questions. Galileo was placed under house arrest for supporting heliocentrism. Marie Curie was mocked for pursuing science as a woman. Martin Luther King Jr. was vilified, surveilled, and ultimately assassinated. Even in smaller ways, this pattern repeats. The entrepreneur with an unusual business model, the artist with a distinctive style, the person who speaks up against groupthink in a meeting. But why? Why does difference so reliably trigger negative reactions? There are several psychological mechanisms at play when people react negatively to others. First, we have what psychologists call social comparison theory. Humans naturally compare themselves to others. When someone appears to be excelling or living authentically, it can trigger insecurity in others who feel they're falling short. As the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer put it, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. And when you're aiming at targets others don't even recognize, confusion and criticism follow naturally. Second, we have cognitive dissonance. People develop worldviews that help them make sense of reality. When your actions or ideas challenge those worldviews, it creates mental discomfort. Rather than reconstructing their entire belief system, many people find it easier to reject you. Nietzsche captured this when he wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." Third, there's the tall poppy syndrome, the social tendency to disparage those who achieve notable success. In ancient Greece, this was so recognized that the tyrant Periander supposedly demonstrated his governing philosophy by walking through a field and cutting down any wheat that grew taller than the rest. And finally, we have simple misunderstanding. Communication is imperfect. Your intentions, no matter how pure, will sometimes be misinterpreted through the filters of others' experiences and biases. The surprising value of being disliked. Now here's where our perspective shifts. What if opposition isn't something to merely endure, but actually contains hidden value? The Japanese philosopher Ichiro Kishimi, in his book The Courage to be Disliked, argues that freedom comes from accepting that you cannot please everyone. The moment you release yourself from the impossible task of universal approval, you gain the freedom to live authentically. Consider also the concept of anti-fragility, developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Anti-fragile systems don't just withstand stress, they actually get stronger from it. Criticism, opposition, and even hatred can function as a form of resistance training for your resolve. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. But perhaps we can go further. No one can make you feel inferior if you recognize their disapproval as evidence you're making an impact. In fact, if you examine most meaningful movements throughout history, they follow a predictable pattern that Mahatma Gandhi summarized. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. This pattern reveals something profound about the nature of innovation and change. New ideas disrupt the status quo, and those who benefit from existing systems naturally resist. Your ability to withstand this resistance might be precisely what determines whether your vision ultimately prevails. Consider, too, that opposition often serves as a filtering mechanism, separating casual interest from serious commitment. Those who persist through criticism demonstrate the kind of conviction that ultimately attracts allies and supporters who share their values. As the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu noted, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. The resistance you face may contain precisely the opportunity you need to refine your approach and strengthen. How to transform opposition into advantage. So, if some level of disapproval is inevitable and potentially valuable, how do we work with it rather than being crushed by it? First, develop discernment. Not all criticism is equal. Some feedback contains valuable insights about your blind spots. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus advised, if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, he was ignorant of my other faults, else he would have mentioned those also. This humorous response contains deep wisdom. Recognize that valid criticism can help you grow, while baseless criticism reveals more about the critic than about you. Second, cultivate inner anchoring. Throughout history, those who withstood intense opposition shared one quality. They anchored their self-worth in something deeper than public opinion. As Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote, between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This inner anchoring doesn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive of feedback. Rather, it means developing the capacity to evaluate criticism on its merits without allowing it to determine your fundamental sense of worth. It means recognizing that your value as a human being exists prior to and independent of others' assessments. This perspective allows you to receive criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, asking, what might I learn here? Rather than, how can I protect myself from this attack? This shift alone can transform opposition from a source of pain to a source of growth. Using opposition as navigation. Third, use opposition as navigation. If your goal is originality or innovation, some resistance actually confirms you're moving in a new direction. As Oscar Wilde quipped, be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. The poet and civil rights activist Audre Lorde put it another way. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid. This principle applies across domains. In science, anomalies that contradict existing theories often point the way to breakthrough discoveries. In art, work that initially provokes rejection frequently becomes the foundation for new movements. In business, products that experts dismiss as impractical sometimes disrupt entire industries. Opposition can serve as confirmation that you're pushing boundaries and exploring new territory. The absence of resistance might actually indicate that you're treading familiar and therefore less impactful ground. Fourth, find your true audience. While universal approval is impossible, finding your 1,000 true fans, the people who deeply resonate with your authentic expression, is both possible and fulfilling. As the ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca noted, "He who pleases the crowd pleases not for long, but truth is a delight only to a few." Throughout history, ideas that initially attracted only a small but passionate following have often grown into movements that changed society. Early adopters of new perspectives serve as bridges to wider acceptance. By focusing on connecting deeply with those who naturally resonate with your message, rather than diluting yourself to appeal to everyone, you create the foundation for sustainable impact. This approach requires patience and faith, the willingness to speak authentically, even when the immediate audience seems small. Practicing appropriate detachment. And finally, practice appropriate detachment. The 14th Dalai Lama suggests, do not let the behavior of others destroy your inner peace. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. Rather, it means recognizing that taking all criticism personally creates unnecessary suffering. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu captured this when he wrote, "Care about what other people think, and you will always be their prisoner." This teaching appears across wisdom traditions because it addresses a universal human challenge, learning to act with conviction while releasing attachment to specific outcomes or reactions. Appropriate detachment allows you to receive both praise and criticism with a certain equanimity, recognizing that neither fully defines you. It enables you to persist in the face of opposition without becoming bitter or resentful. Consider the practice of distinguishing between what the Stoics called matters within our control and matters outside our control. Your actions, intentions, and responses fall into the first category. Others' reactions, circumstances, and external events fall into the second. By focusing your energy primarily on what you can control, the quality and integrity of your work, the clarity of your communication, your own ethical conduct, you free yourself from the exhausting effort to manage others' perceptions. This shift in focus doesn't just reduce suffering, it actually improves performance by directing your attention toward variables you can actually influence. As the philosopher and emperor Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. From survival to thriving, let's bring this full circle. The title promised not just coping with disapproval, but turning it into victory. History shows us that the most transformative figures weren't those who avoided criticism, but those who understood its inevitability and pressed forward anyway. They didn't just survive opposition, they used it as fuel. Think of Abraham Lincoln, who faced brutal criticism and mockery, yet responded, "I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." Or Nelson Mandela, who emerged from 27 years of imprisonment saying, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "To be great is to be misunderstood." But perhaps we can modify this slightly. To be great is to be misunderstood and to continue forward anyway, knowing that the world rarely welcomes new ideas immediately. Consider the ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or living well. The philosophers who developed this idea weren't concerned with popularity, but with living virtuously according to one's purpose, regardless of public opinion. This perspective invites us to shift our definition of success from external validation to internal congruence, alignment between our values and our actions. From this vantage point, opposition becomes not an obstacle to success, but part of the journey toward a more meaningful kind of achievement. The capacity to face criticism while maintaining your integrity might actually be one of life's most important skills. As the psychotherapist Carl Jung noted, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming often requires withstanding social pressure to conform to existing expectations. The paradox of approval. There's a beautiful paradox at work in all of this. Often, those who most desperately seek approval are the least likely to receive it. Conversely, those who focus on living with integrity and purpose, who accept that some disapproval is inevitable, often end up earning deep respect, even from former critics. As the psychologist Carl Rogers observed, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. So perhaps the question isn't, why does everyone hate me, but rather, what truth am I expressing that challenges others? What growth might this opposition be inviting in me? And how can I use this resistance to clarify and strengthen my purpose? The French philosopher Albert Camus wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer." Your core of resilience and purpose doesn't depend on universal approval. In fact, it may shine brightest precisely when challenged. So the next time you feel the sting of being disliked, criticized, or misunderstood, remember, you're an excellent historical company, and this resistance may be exactly the force you need to develop your fullest strength. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, remember the words of Theodore Roosevelt, who knew something about facing critics. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Dare greatly, my friends. The world may not always applaud, but that's how you know you're creating something new.